Once upon a recent time, a grandpa and a grandma thought about their relationship with their grandchildren near and far. They wanted a stronger connection with the children they loved so well. They wanted to be remembered and leave stories the children would tell. Then they found a novel solution. The main character they could become in their very own childhood stories, a book of 5 or 6 and then some. The grands got very excited writing stories about their past. Through their eyes of their young character, they shared stories they now knew would last. They loved the amazing moments of surprised and thoughtful reflection as grandchildren pondered those stories and made a loving connection that the characters they loved so well and had come to really enjoy were their beloved grandparents as the youthful girl and boy. Their books became family treasures as grandchildren turned the pages, and the stories were well remembered by all and on through the ages. How do you want to be remembered? And don't we all want to be memorable? Not famous, but well remembered for something that's important to you. And isn't that what we want in our own way? But to be especially memorable to our grandchildren and our posterity. So how do we become memorable? So backtrack a bit. Let me explain how I got to be here. My name is Pamela Reed. And 20 years ago, I had a very distinct dream, vision perhaps, was amazingly clear, of grandparents reading storybooks to their grandchildren, but they were books about themselves. Now, at the time, I was a qualified teacher of English, and I had published several books, and so I felt like I could do this. So I started teaching people how to write their stories. 5 children at the time. Now we have 21 grandchildren, and I realize how important it is to be important to them. And so over the last 20 years, that vision has expanded, and I went back to university, did postgraduate work on connecting generations through their stories. And I've been particularly driven by this concept to help grandparents and their grandchildren make this very special connection. But as I have taught these grandparents over the years, I've heard expressed time and time again, I want to be part of my grandchildren's lives. I want to have a meaningful influence. I want them to know me. And then the other thought was, I want to be remembered. And remembered well. And so this whole idea of want your grandchildren to know you, want them to remember you, we can summarize that. Know me, remember me. Now let's keep that in mind. I want you to imagine you're reading that bedtime story, and you're reading a book to your grandchildren, and it's a book about you, and you are the main character. So at this point, I want to make a point. I really appreciate biographies. When I was 20, I wrote my life story. It took 12 pages. And years later, as I was doing my postgrad work, I reread it, and I realized that I had provided an overview of my young life with a few adult observations on it. There was nothing that would engage or delight my future children and grandchildren. And, the thought, a dry recitation of facts actually comes to mind. So biographies are wonderful and they're important literature, but I am concerned that they're missing this younger generation that actually needs these stories the most. but in a way that they can relate to them, they can be enthused by them. And the comparison of an overview as opposed to a fun young character that has a series of incidents or adventures, and they become relatable, they become relevant to the children, lovable, definitely memorable. A little story. One of my granddaughters, 5 or 6 years of age, and she had to run a very special race at school, and she was really, really worried. And so much so it was causing her to cry and have a bit of a meltdown, which was on the floor. So I lay down beside her and I started telling her a story about Pamela June, who had to run a very special race, but she was a little bit worried because as they got lined up for the race, she really wanted to go to the bathroom. When the man said go, she raced as hard as she could, straight through the end of the race, straight to the bathroom, and when she came back, she'd won the race and she'd set a new age group record. As I finished the story, my granddaughter had finished crying, and she just looked at me, she said, "Grandma, are you Pamela June?" I was like, "Yes, darling." And she just snuggled up close and she says, "Tell me another Pamela June story." And so isn't that what we need when our grandchildren will say, "Tell me another young you story"? Now, the other thing over the years, many conversations and workshops, there have been some recurring fears or objections or a bit of a reluctance, and I realised that I had to overcome these objections. And so one was, I can't remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what happened 50 plus years ago. And so I had to create memory boosters and a series that would bring these memories out. Another was it's such a bad experience with English and writing at school. I'm no good at writing. And so I realized I had to overcome that and create these writing essentials that were really easy to follow and would overcome that reluctance. And then there was the thought of, well, who would really read my stories? Who would be interested? And so overcoming that reluctance from a person to recognize how really unique and special they were. And if anybody was going to understand that, it would be their own grandchildren. One that puzzled me was, "I haven't got the time." And that one, I was like, really? You haven't got the time for your grandchildren? And so, but I also realized I need to make the approach quick, and so that the stories could be recorded fast and effectively. And so here was the approach, overcoming the objections. But the one big realization that people kind of forget is that the plot is already written on every one of these stories. The story has happened, and so what we're doing is recreating it in a fun, fast and effective way, keeping in mind your grandchild audience as your motivation, and suddenly it slips into more of a can-do category. So I devised, this is how Grand Connect came to be, this simple 5-step process to make the young you a reality. And it has been so exciting to see these little characters emerge from people's memories. And, hesitantly at first, but then the flow starts and the stories just keep coming, and that's exciting. So just going back to our beginning poem, as grandchildren pondered those stories and made a loving connection, that the characters they loved so well and had come to really enjoy were their beloved grandparents as the youthful girl and boy. This is your opportunity to become more relatable, more appealing, more memorable. And while we're dealing with more, the more stories, the more connection. The more connection, the more memorable. The more memorable, the more impact. And you want to have this impact in the lives of your grandchildren. So, the main character. Again, I want you to use your imagination. I love helping people visualize their young you as a character. So I want you to imagine an image that fits your memory of the young you. Is it the kid that stands with their hands on their hips and confident? Is it the ponderer? Is it the dreamer? Is it the bookworm? You know, there's so many different things. So get an image in your mind of that character. Now, imagine that character having your experiences. So, bit of visualization here, but imagine that character doing the things within your experience. And then you write about them. And that's when the connection starts to happen. Now, when you write about them, you take it completely away from I did this and I did that. Because quite frankly, the old you is comforting and lovable, but not completely relatable when you start talking about stories from your youth. Whereas the young you is very relatable, very relevant to your young audience. And so be aware that writing about your character puts it into what we call third person, where you're writing about their adventures, about what they did. And from experience, as we write about the character, we actually take a step back and we become more objective in our writing, more descriptive, because we're seeing a bigger picture. And so that gives better perspective, but it also actually improves your writing. So the Michael Margolis is an expert, if you say, on the value of storytelling. And he tells us that we create culture through the stories we tell. Now, if we think in terms of a young child, you know, their brain is like a sponge. They're just soaking up information at great rates. They're absorbing everything, and it makes sense that the earlier in a child's life that these family stories and personal stories are communicated, the deeper that connection becomes. And that is how this family culture is created. And so creating that culture through the stories we tell, but we've got to start with the stories. Now, another strange thing I'm going to ask you is to grow up with your children or with your grandchildren. By starting with a young character in a young situation and thinking really seriously about your audience and how you are writing for them. Think about writing for them in their moment, in their age group, in their situation, and then find the parallels within your experience. So, you know, we're thinking of an age group here, a range of 0 to 11 years. Obviously, you can't remember exactly what happened in those really, really early years. But if we think of the Anika story, running a race, really concerned about what was going to happen. Pamela June running a race, really concerned about what was going to happen. You know, so we find these parallels in our experience. Now, the more stories you tell, you actually develop a style of your own, and that's pretty exciting. Because as you develop your style of writing, you're becoming more confident, more capable in your story writing, and that enables you to then write deeper and more meaningful stories as your grandchildren grow. So as they get older, you give them older stories. And because they've gotten to know your character, you grow with them. And that's a pretty exciting prospect. Now, at the beginning, I said that, or I explained that my background was as a teacher and an author, and then as a grandmother. I'd like to add one more thing. I've also spent time as a funeral celebrant or officiant. And part of that was to help families to write about the family member who had passed on. Now, sadly, there were many times when the family really struggled to think of relevant stories, of any stories. There was just that struggle there. Conversely, there was families I met with where the stories were well known and there was a great joy there and a happy celebration of the life lived. And so I then really began to focus on this course and to help people to write those stories so that they would be well remembered and lovingly remembered. So when we talk about the stories, my idea is that we create a story book. And so here we have a Pamela June storybook. And the thing I love about this is a new version of my stories and illustrated by Brooklyn Reed and Pamela Reed. And so for this one, I collaborated with my 12-year-old granddaughter on the illustrations. And that lives, that just adds a whole other level of connection to this as well. There's just knowing into the way that you can convey these stories. Because when I dreamed about this, it was just pages in a folder. Now we can do hard copy books, we can do e-books, we can do PowerPoint books that turn the pages, we can do audio versions, video versions. There's just no limit, but we've got to have the stories written down. So with my course, I was like, we've got to make this easy to do, 6 simple modules, self-paced, lots of encouragement and support so that we can create these wonderful storybooks. And there will be a link at the end where you can find out more what that is all about. We have so much fun creating these characters or recreating these characters. So it's a fun journey to be part of. Now, I'd like to share from a wonderful writer, Dr. Seuss, who writes in one of his books, Horton Hears a Who. And this expression, which I think sums up a lot, today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. And I just love this idea of delighting in who you are and what you have become, but what you can become as the main character in your stories, so that children can delight in that character who is no one is youer than you. Now, I took a little bit of artistic license and added a little bit to Dr. Seuss. Yesterday you were you, that is truer than true, but your grandchildren are growing and they need the young you. Your grandchildren are growing up in a vastly different world, but they still need the same life skills and principles that you needed when you were their age. Tomorrow you'll be you, that is truer than true, and your stories will remain long after you do. And so keep reaching, keep teaching, not preaching, through your characters' stories, all the things that you want them to know, so that when they remember you, they remember what matters to you most and what you stand for. So as grandparents, what do we want? I know I want my grandchildren to know me. I want them to remember me. And so know me, remember me, It starts with just one story. So, happy writing, happy grand connecting.